So now I'm going to take you back to the overview of my book and picking back up with chapter 12, which is called the name of the story is, well, I'm not going to tell you the name of the story. I don't remember. Oh, yeah, of course I know the name of the story. I'm not going to tell you, though, because I'm going to tell you in a second. But those of you who have read my Morocco book, With Open Arms, will be familiar with this story.
A Turkish Bath in Morocco is one of two stories that is actually already in that I first published in my Morocco book, With Open Arms, Short Stories of Misadventures in Morocco. But I just had to include it in this book because a Turkish bath, it goes so perfectly with the themes and with the other stories in Porcelain Travels. And anecdotally, it just also seems to be one of the favorite stories with readers from that collection. So I don't know that I need to explain more than that. A Turkish bath in Morocco, I guess I'll just say that it's one of those experiences that in hindsight is pretty funny, but while I was living it, it was not funny at all.
Strangers in the Night. This was just a really strange night that I had when I was traveling with a friend in Paris. This particular night, we both decided to do our own thing. I went out, she went out, we did our own thing. I came home before she did, and I went to bed. Well, hours after I had already gone to sleep, someone barges into my room. And of course, I'm not expecting this. I'm jolted awake. I don't know if it's a thief, if it's, if I'm under some sort of threat.
And so Strangers in the Night is about that episode. But then it's also about a flashback to a hilarious thing that happened when a Parisian friend was visiting me here in San Francisco. And then it also just has this really sort of over-the-top ending. So that's Strangers in the Night. A Real Shortage is a story about when I was living in Istanbul, Turkey. And this isn't necessarily that funny. I think it's entertaining. I hope it's entertaining.
It's really, again, sort of focused on the cultural aspects, the cultural experiences that we can have sometimes, specifically related, in this case, to water, a real shortage of water. I was living in Istanbul, and I was living in the center in a really old neighborhood, in a really old building, and we only got water every few days, or every 2 or 3 days, depending. And so this is just some anecdotes about how we dealt with that and how the landlady dealt with that. And then my experiences, of course, never having dealt with that sort of situation before, just kind of how I did and some of the things that resulted. A Dire Miscalculation. This is another story that, as the title suggests, is in line pretty directly with what you might expect Porcelain Travels to be about. And what I mean by that, again, is I am talking very explicitly here, although, again, sort of not in an off-color way, but I am talking explicitly about a biological process and a very grave mistake that I made while traveling on a boat on the Nile.
And that was one that I really had to swallow my pride to write. So, again, A Dire Miscalculation in Egypt. You Called Me a Girl is a story that I wrote
here again in California this time, in Tamales Bay, a couple hours north of San Francisco. And I'm not sure what to tell you about this one, other than there was some violence, a bit of an assault that resulted from a misunderstanding related to the bathroom. And I think that's kind of all I can tell you about that one. Really bizarre 24 hours. So that's You Called Me a Girl. Identity Crisis. This is about, anyone I think who's traveled to Europe.
So many tubs/showers in Europe don't have shower curtains. And I've lived there several times. I've spent a lot of time traveling in Europe, and I've never understood it. And it just annoys me. I don't understand why they just don't buy shower curtains. So this is just a short story that takes place in Valencia, Spain, where I sort of recount my experience trying to shower without a shower curtain.
Now You See It is just a really quick story. It's only about 800 words, but it's about a shower that I encountered in Oslo, Norway, not too long ago. And it was in this minuscule bathroom. The apartment wasn't so small, but for whatever reason, the bathroom was minuscule. And so the owner of the apartment had installed this shower that just made it was an ingenious use of space. And so, like I said, really short story, 800 words, but it fit really well, again, with the other stories in this book. Watching You. This is another pretty short story, and it's from, again, California. I was camping on what's called the Lost Coast.
And one morning I woke up, it was gray, it was misty, it was kind of foggy, and my friends were still asleep, but I had to go to the bathroom. So I went to the beach, on the edge of the beach, and started to do my business, thinking I was completely alone. Well, it turns out I wasn't alone. And so this story is about the interaction that I had as I'm doing my business, that morning. Out in the Cold is one of my favorite stories. This is from when I was an exchange student in Spain, and my friend was also an exchange student in Finland at the time, in high school. And so once school wrapped up, I decided to go see my friend in Helsinki. Well, I got to the Nordic countries earlier than expected.
So I decided to take the long way and go up through Norway, come across Sweden, and back down to Finland that way. Well, not having expected to go to the Arctic Circle, I wasn't prepared to go to the Arctic Circle, and I really found myself in a bind when it turned out there were no trains and no hotels, and I was sort of stuck in the Arctic Circle. And so Out in the Cold is about how I dealt with that little predicament.
So this is the second story from my With Open Arms Morocco book, and it's another one that just deals so specifically with the subject matter dealt with in the other stories, of course, in my travels that I had included. And it's also one of my favorite stories about, there were four of us and we were making our way out into the Sahara sand dunes. And some things didn't go quite right for one of the guys that was with us. Rising sign, I'm Scorpio rising, that's an allusion to that. And this story is the second one that takes place in Malta. And there's also another flashback story here that takes place in Turkey. It's actually a shorter but a more intense story. So that's Rising sign.
No Refuge. This is another really long story. This is another one, sort of like the Bin in the Bomb that I mentioned is the second story. This is really sort of a collection of stories. And I was living in France. I was in Paris at the time, but I was running out of money. But I was getting a lot of writing done, and I wasn't ready to come back home. And so I needed to get creative, and I needed to find sort of a situation that would allow me to still be overseas, still be in France, but not spend a lot of money. And so I found this work trade situation. Well, as it turns out, this was not a refuge. This was not an equitable sort of trade, and it actually ended up being a really bad situation. As it turns out,
I was able to find online some information about what happened to people who had been at this place after me. And crazy, just really crazy. Let It Flow, this is the second to the last story.
But this is a story that, again, does deal with biological processes, and it's sort of the opposite of my previous story that deals with them in the sense that I'm on a bus in Turkey, and I've really, really got to go, but the bus is not stopping. And so the story is about, again, how I sort of deal with that.
Finally, last but again not least, Grin and Bury It. This is, I was staying for 3 months on the Spanish island of Mallorca.
It's about a bit of a crisis in this house where I'm staying. Well, the story then is about how I deal with the crisis, but then once I've dealt with the crisis, I'm still left in a bind.
And so the story is about how I deal with the crisis, but then how I also deal with the bind that this crisis leaves me in. So, that is my off-the-cuff, impromptu attempt to describe each of the 25 stories in my new book, Porcelain Travels.
So the whole bathroom thing took me 2 days and 3 brands of bubble bath. And it was it wasn't until I got to that third brand of bubble bath that I could actually get bubbles that would stay bubbly for the 20 minutes that it took to do each of those sessions. So anyway, that's just a little trivia for you about that shoot. And my other concern, of course, was that I was going to electrocute myself, which thankfully, clearly, I did not.